to yet another talk of our History Hour. Today we have with us a very important and a very knowledgeable person. We have with us Dr. Vishvesh Kandolkar, who will speak to us on Invisible Skin, the architectural history of the Basilica of Bom Jesus. A warm welcome to all of you present at this History Hour of ours. And as we begin today's History Hour, I'd like to invite the director of Xavier Center, Father Anthony da Silva, to formally welcome all of us to this History Hour.
Thank you, Father Anderson. Am I audible?
Yes, you are, Tony. Go ahead.
Okay. We are delighted to have Dr. Vishvesh Kandolkar speak to us this evening. As you know very well, Xavier Center has a deep commitment to the history of Goa. And this particular church, this Basilica in Old Goa, is really an iconic church because it represents not only Goa as it is today, but it represents the recent history of Goa of more than 400 years since the arrival of Francis Xavier and the others from the West. We are happy at Xavier Center that Dr. Kandolkar will speak to this theme of church architecture, because we believe that church architecture in Goa has a statement to make to the people of Goa as well as to the visitors of Goa. And a lot of studies have been done, as you may know very well. And we at the Xavier Center pursue this interest in greater depth. So we are happy in that sense that Dr. Vishvesh Kandolkar will increase our knowledge and understanding of the history of the Bom Jesus Basilica. In addition, I'd just like to say a word that Xavier Center also pursues other aspects and perspectives of history, the history of India, and also Jesuit history. Jesuit history, more recently, the center has taken up because we realize that Jesuit history also ties in very well with the history of India. And so in that sense, we try to tease out some common themes between Jesuit history and the history of our country. That's all I'm allowed to say at this time because we have very limited time. I welcome all of you to this session, and we hope you enjoy this evening. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Father Tony, for those words of welcome and introducing the Xavier Center and our flagship History Hour programs. Our moderator this evening is Dr. Benedito Ferrao. I don't have to introduce him because he is well known in these history circles. So I'll directly hand over the session to Dr. Benedito Ferrao. Dr. Benedito, over to you.
Thanks, Father Anderson and Father Tony, for hosting this History Hour with Dr. Vishvesh Kandolkar. Let me briefly introduce Dr. Kandolkar. He's an associate professor at Goa College of Architecture, where he researches Goa's architectural history with a focus on early modern church design and the creation of Indo-Portuguese aesthetics and their afterlife. Apart from considering the social aspects of architectural legacies, he also attends to neoliberal co-optations of design influences. His writing on art, architecture, and cultural politics has been published in various fora, including Economic and Political Weekly, Journal of Human Values, and the Goan. You can actually read more of Dr. Kandolkar's work on the Basilica in two articles on EPW, Economic and Political Weekly. And I just want to add, before I turn it over to Dr. Kandolkar, that I'll be moderating the discussion. Please post your questions in the chat, and I'll be keeping tabs on them. And I will deliver those questions to Dr. Kandolkar at the end. So yes, please go ahead and use the chat feature. Thanks so much, and over to you, Dr. Kandolkar.
Thank you. First and foremost, I would like to thank Xavier Center of Historical Research, especially Father Dr. Anthony and Father Anderson, for inviting me to do this online talk. I would also like to thank Dr. Benito Ferran for the introduction and moderating the history hour. Most importantly, I would like to acknowledge the presence of so many people who have tuned in to listen to this talk. Thank you. This talk is dedicated to Dadu Mandrekar, a poet, writer, photographer, and a champion of Ambedkarite politics in Goa, who passed away today morning. Let me now take you on a visual journey of one of the most important icons of Goan identity. The Basilica of Bom Jesus stood intact for more than 4 centuries, but then there was a gaping hole in the roof. This resulted in the building flooding after rains in April this year. Following this, the rector of the Basilica, Father Patricio Fernandez, raised an alarm, reproaching the ASI of utter neglect, leading to the deterioration of the Basilica and the shrine of Goans Sahib, St. Francis Xavier. Following the collective outcry of public, many ministers, including the Chief Minister of Goa, visited the Basilica and ensured speedy action. Because of the letter, which was widely reported by local media, be it the Times of India, the Navin Times, the Goan, or the Herald in this case on the screen, the Basilica's roof was repaired prior to the monsoon. Nevertheless, as indicated by measures of this nature that are only undertaken when controversy brews, these symptomatic actions are insufficient. Perhaps this is one of the instances where public pressure resulted in immediate action, indicating that Bom Jesus is kind of a symbol of political revival in Goa. Because its reputation was being pilloried publicly, the ASI repaired a section of the roof over the passage of the courtyard, though in reality, the entirety of the monument needs assessment. The monsoons are an annual affair in South Asia, so while a small section of the roof may have been patched up for now, this does not inoculate the building from future damage. As this suggests, there are other problems that require attention to ensure monuments' long-term protection. One such pressing issue is about the church's look, and I'm putting it in quotes. Today, a generation of Goans have grown accustomed to seeing the basilica's exposed laterite walls, but this was not the way the building was designed, nor indeed the way it looked about 70 years ago. It was the then famous, or perhaps infamous, restorer from Portugal, Baltazar da Silva Castro, who in the 1950s brought about a dramatic transformation of the external appearance of the basilica by having the plaster removed and leaving the underlying laterite stone exposed. We can see this basilica here. Dr. Joaquim Santos claims that such deplastering was a part of Premier Antonio de Oliveira de Salazar's nationalistic ideology, where monuments in Portugal were falsely restored to look ancient or rather medievalized to proclaim the antiquity of the Portuguese Empire. Here we see example of São Salvador in Portugal. Similarly, Santos adds that many such ideologically motivated restorations were initially undertaken in Salazar-ruled Portugal during the 1940s, again to reinforce the nationalistic agenda, essentially using heritage of historical buildings to establish the long lineage of the Portuguese nation. In the 20th century, by removing the skin of the building, such as Bom Jesus in Old Goa, Baltazar Castro was able to transform these monuments into relics of Portugal's early modern past in Goa. This ensured that, along with the relics of the 16th century saint, historical buildings could also serve as evidence or visual evidence of longevity of the Portuguese presence in Goa. But the question is, why, after centuries of its existence as a whitewashed monument, did the administration transform the external aesthetics of the Bom Jesus to a brown one? Look at this evidence. The first is an aerial photograph of the basilica taken in 1935, which shows that it is plastered, as I've indicated in the slide itself. And here is another photograph of the whitewashed Bom Jesus from the 1951, just prior to the removal of the plaster. And this is taken by Mario Chico mission, which had come here to study the buildings. So yes, the question is, why make these buildings look older in 1952? It was because in the decolonial moment, the Portuguese administration had planned to hold on one of the greatest and grandest exposition of St. Francis Xavier, where a large number of people were expected to gather in Old Goa in 1952. In fact, Pamela Gupta estimates that there were around 8 lakh people who attended the exposition of the saint that year. Consider that the exposition was held at a time when there was an increased pressure on Portugal to relinquish its hold on Goa, especially by India, a former British colony which had won its independence in 1947. However, Portugal refused to negotiate a cession of its oldest overseas territory on the grounds that Goa and other parts of Portuguese India that constituted the subcontinent geographically were integral part of the Portuguese nation politically. This is what Oliver Salazar himself said. And the premier points out that Goa was historically and culturally different from neighboring nation. To quote him, he says, "No qualified traveler passing into Goa from the Indian Union can fail to gain the impression that he is entering an entirely different land. The way people think, feel, and act is European." He continues, "There may be no geographic or economic frontier, but there is indubitably a human one. Goa is the transplantation of the West onto Eastern land, the expression of Portugal in India." End of the quote. As political climate was becoming exceedingly untenable for Portugal to hold on to its territories in Portuguese India, the colonial state took on every opportunity to assert Goa's historically and culturally difference from India. For the 1952 event, because the 400-year-old body that was kept on display was of a Catholic saint with the Iberian origins, it allowed the state to showcase Goa's Europeanized culture. Additionally, his popularity across religion and caste divides, as would have been evidenced by large gathering of people during the event, which would also help to promote the state's propaganda that Goans, irrespective of their religion, were culturally different from the rest of neighboring India. To change the slide here, similarly, the architecture of the monuments in Old Goa, which the state had carefully integrated as a part of the exposition itinerary that year in 1952, was equally old, belonging to the early modern period and had European influences. Therefore, the purpose of removal of the plaster, and one can see here in the background, be it of Viceroys Arch, another monument where the plaster was removed, or the Bom Jesus, was to make these monuments look even more older by making them look like relics from the centuries earlier. The showcasing of large crowds of Xavier's devotees, Old Goa's churches and convents, as well as the remains of the Spanish saint during the exposition, 1952 exposition, supported the state's propaganda that Goa was indeed a transplantation of the West onto Eastern lands. Besides, for locals visiting Old Goa to celebrate the feast every December, the dramatic transformation of the buildings from the exposition would have signaled that the state was doing something to maintain these monuments. By 1952, in fact, for almost 100 years, these expositions, as seen in this 1890 illustration here, had become a common trend. However, I argue that removal of the plaster was nominal change, which brought about maximum effect to impress regular visitors to Old Goa. No major additions to pre-existing monuments were undertaken by the state, neither were new edifices added in the erstwhile capital. This reflects the economic failure of the state, which relied on the architectural strategies, such as the removal of the plaster, to make the buildings look different and old. Essentially, the state used ideologically motivated restorations of the 16th and 17th century monuments to divert attention away from their failure to offer substantial and new developments in Goa. That too, these works were undertaken because architectural legacy of historical monuments were important as much as the 400-year-old relics of the saint. Seen collectively as a part of spectacle with a large gathering of people attending the event, the exposition held against the backdrop of aged monuments was to suggest that indeed Goa belonged to the long lineage of the Portuguese nation. Remember, apart from large number of devotees, large number of international press was also invited to witness the event in 1952. To reiterate, the removal of the whitewashed lime plaster of Bom Jesus or the false restoration was a part of political ideology to showcase the longevity of the empire to those who had gathered to witness the event. To get some perspective of this particular moment, removal of the plaster, false restoration, and about national identity, let us consider the recent example where conservation is highly disputed. The Notre Dame of Paris comes to mind, which was devastated after the deadly fire in 2019. Immediately following the public outcry, the burning down of the monument, which is considered as French national icon, the Frenchness, so to say, the current French president, Emmanuel Macron, declared that he would rebuild the monument immediately. In fact, money for the reconstruction was pledged by rich private individuals and companies in France and elsewhere. This was, after all, the prestige of France. Writing in the Washington Post, Meredith Cohen, an associate professor of medieval art and architecture at UCLA, notes that, to quote her, while long overdue and very welcome, it is also a reminder that it is too often takes a catastrophic accident like this to elicit the funding to preserve artistic treasures like Notre Dame, a tendency that unfortunately makes such tragedies seems necessary to save historic monuments. End of the quote. Recall how in the case of Basilica too, a tragedy followed by public outcry led to its restoration this year. Nevertheless, to return to Notre Dame, the question of its restoration is, to which original condition should the monument be returned to? After all, the way it looked before the fire was also not its original state, built in 13th century. In fact, the 19th century, the building was redone in a style to showcase the supposedly French Gothic architecture. Already prior to this, in the 19th century, there was a rebuilding which had happened. And there was an addition of a new spire, which you can see in the center, which got burnt down. This 19th century changes to Notre Dame itself is once again an example of what I call false restoration or false additions, because the monument was being returned to its pre-Renaissance condition in France. There too, such restorations seems like fabrication of history because monuments were made to look authentically French in this case. Again, such restorations are part of so-called modern nation states propaganda to use architectural heritage such as Notre Dame, or in the case of Goa, the Bom Jesus, to proclaim the antiquity of French in the case of Notre Dame, or the Portuguese nation in case of Bom Jesus, respectively. To go into the details of architectural transformation of Notre Dame, or how this monument itself actually is neither French fully nor European, because it says that there's been a lot of looting of influences and architectural styles from the East, so to say, is part of another talk. But nevertheless, more importantly, Professor Cohen observes that before the fire, the Notre Dame was already undergoing urgent conservation because the interventions of 19th century, as mentioned earlier, restorers such as Eugene Emmanuel Viollet-le-Duc and Jean-Baptiste Lassus, including the spire they had rebuilt, was causing damage. She says that the stones these restorers had replaced in the walls on the flying buttresses were also eroding at a faster pace than 12th century stone they had left in place. So the building's structural integrity was already compromised. End of the quote. Essentially, even returning the Notre Dame to its 19th century state after the 2019 fire is problematic, especially as the building was already facing problems because of those interventions. Similarly, to get back to Bom Jesus, sorry. Similarly, I would argue that the so-called restorations of Bom Jesus in 1950s was problematic, and this should not be considered at its original state by any figment of imagination. Think again, the monument was built in the 16th century, and the alterations which affected the Bom Jesus was only carried out in the 20th century. Today, when we reflect the history of the church as a brown monument belonging to so-called Portuguese period of Goa, amounts to reducing the 4 centuries of monuments history as being monolithic. In terms of history, the Basilica of Bom Jesus, built in 1594, is older than Taj Mahal. And this is also true of the Portuguese, which were here much before the Mughal Empire takes a throne in Delhi. And one has to therefore understand the long period of Portuguese colonialism in Goa, and also the history of some of these monuments. So consider that this monument is older than Taj Mahal. Taj Mahal is built in 1632. The basilica, on the other hand, was commissioned in 1594 and consecrated in 1605, 16th century or end of 16th century. It was built by Jesuits and specifically to house the relics of Saint Francis Xavier, who died in 1552, and the relics were shifted here only in 1624 after he was declared as a saint in 1622. In fact, while building it, the Jesuits, who are generally at that time known to live a frugal, they were frugal in the way they spending money, especially on monuments, decided that the last minute to decorate the entire facade of the Bom Jesus with the granite imported all the way from Bassein near Bombay. The import of this expensive material shows that Jesuits took extra efforts to make the monument as special, which was befitting the status of the saint. Historian Paulo Varela Gomes maintains, to quote him, "The Bom Jesus has unique facade in the history of Christian architecture, one of the outstanding monuments of architecture in India." End of the quote. Further, he adds that the lasting contribution of the basilica is that it allowed local artisans to domesticate European architectural and ornamental vocabulary to make it their own. End of the quote. Not only the artisans and labor involved in its constructions were local, but much of the material in which the church is built, such as laterite stones and timber, were also sourced locally. While it is true that the inspiration of the building aesthetics might have come from Europe, and that too, it's not necessarily linked to Europe itself, because we know that things like rose window and other elements are not European by itself, whereas it's again coming from Jerusalem or other parts of Asia. The monument, in this case, Bom Jesus, is a part of much more part of a Goan heritage itself, because the skills and labor of locals contributed to the construction and thereafter its maintenance for last 400 years. It is a local, very much Goan monument. The Basilica of Bom Jesus is among the few monuments to have survived the steady decline of old Goa, the city which was once the capital of Salvador, India. And one can see on the plan here that the city was really thriving. It's very few monuments to have survived that period. The peak, which was around 1560s to around 1630s. At one time, the Portuguese territories, or what is called Portuguese Indies, spanned from Cape of Good Hope in Africa to Macau in China. So it was a huge territory. And the Basilica, this is a plan which shows Basilica at the center. This plan is done in 1777 approximately. The Basilica survived despite the fact that Portugal expelled its original benefactors, the economically powerful religious order of the Jesuits from Goa in 1759. Other buildings whose owners were also ousted by the Portuguese state did not enjoy the same fate. For example, the then contemporaneous building to the Bom Jesus, the grand complex of the Augustines in Old Goa, fell into ruins immediately after the expulsion of the religious order from Goa in 1835. First in 1759, the Jesuits were expelled, and then 1835, all the religious orders were expelled from Goa, essentially partly leading to its ruination. Essentially, monuments which endure a long afterlife, such as Bom Jesus, do so because they have been cared for and looked after. For instance, in 1862, a major restoration of the Bom Jesus was undertaken, including the addition of key structural supports, buttresses to the northern wall, while the roof, and here I'm showing it here on the picture, while the roof of the church was also completely redone. And this is recorded in Albuquerque's book about Casa Professa y Iglesia de Bom Jesus in 1890. It's recorded here that both these things were done around 1862. This picture, which shows the structure in 1890, and this is photographed by Souza and Paul, the elements marked in red are the buttresses that I've been talking about. They were added later. And to prove it, this is the picture, which I'm showing next on the slide, is a photograph of Bom Jesus taken sometime between 1855 and 1860s, which shows that the basilica was without the structural support of the buttresses, which I've shown in the red earlier, before 1862. The question again is that such restorations to safeguard the Bom Jesus arose not solely because the state's desire to look after it, but also because the public pressed the administration to ensure the restoration and preservation of their beloved monument. And why? The 1862 restoration followed the exposition of St. Francis Xavier body held in 1859. In fact, Neri Xavier, a high-ranking official in the administration who wrote the book about the exposition, writes that more than 2 lakh pilgrims were in attendance, and these pilgrims were again of different race, religion, caste, who had gathered here. And he mentions all these things. They had come together to venerate the relics of their favorite saints. Again, think about it, that there's a long lineage of people coming there in lots of numbers to venerate the saint and the building to which the saint has been kept. Such gathering in large numbers shows that people adored the saint as well as his shrine, which in turn pushed the state to invest in the maintaining of the basilica. Perhaps the previously mentioned open letter written by the basilica's rector, Father Patricio, will mark another moment which will draw the attention of all the authorities and the government and urge them to action to save the monument and to take all the actions needed to safeguard it for a long time in the future. One consequence of keeping the basilica exposed is that because the laterite stone is porous when exposed to rain, it absorbs water by capillary action, soaking the entire wall. Further, because of the heavy rainfall in Goa, the exposed surface of the laterite has undergone severe weathering, leading to deterioration of the building. Think about it. When they had removed the plaster in Portugal, the underlying stone was granite. It was not a porous or weak stone like laterite here. And secondly, it doesn't pour and rain in Portugal as much as it does in Goa. The damage that the monument has been sustaining has, moreover, not only been restricted to the exterior surface of the building, it is also seeped in inside. In fact, it is a miracle that the exposed laterite walls of the basilica have withstood the onslaught of the Goan monsoon since the 1950s. The same fate was not accorded to the Arch of the Viceroys, another monument in Old Goa that was deplastered on the recommendation of Restorer Castro in the same period. Sadly, this monument crumbled during the heavy monsoons rain that followed immediately next year. This is in 1953, and the arch visible today is a reconstructed version of the original. Have a look at these 2 images I'm showing on the next slide. The one on the left with the 3-tiered system is the older one, and on the right, which stands today, is a reconstructed version of the arch, which stands today. In fact, the Santos maintains the colonial administration became aware of the problems of unplastered basilica and were in the process of rectifying their mistake in 1960s. However, before they could execute the work, Goa was integrated with the Indian Union. Thereafter, the reluctance of the church and the ESI to repair the historical mistake has led to further ruination of the monument. More importantly, the architecture of the Bom Jesus has come to serve as secular icon to promote Goa as a destination for tourism. Consider that a replica of unplastered brown Bom Jesus was used in floats of Goa, in this case on the left, 1967, as much as 2019, in Republic Day parades in New Delhi. In fact, this is a 2016 image. Even real estate corporations have adopted the brown basilica to sell Goa's land. This, for instance, is a contemporary souvenir available for sale in tourist shops around Goa. It contains a peculiar juxtapositioning of images that are meant to represent Goa. The image of the brown Bom Jesus is combined with palm-filled sandy beach with frolicking tourists. Such convenient superimposition of multiple Goan images in collage form reveals the easy stereotypes in which Goa is commoditized for tourism. observe that in the post-colonial period, the image of the brown unplastered basilica is everywhere, while that of a whitewashed church has been forgotten. The most important question is whether the brown basilica is being maintained as an exposed laterite monument for those from outside Goa, for tourists. Consider that remembering takes more effort than forgetting. And if Goans are to hold on to a unique identity, they need to actively engage with its past. In this light, monuments such as Bom Jesus becomes very important visual evidence of Goa's past, and it is all the more important to hold on to them as markers of identity. For the current Goan public, the brown basilica is the basilica because the image of the edifice in this form has been kind of cultivated through popular media for more than half a century. This is the image of the famed building that the most living in Goa would know, right? Look at this. This is all we see is brown basilica. Similarly, in this image, again used as a backdrop, whether used in the cover picture, etc., it is the brown basilica which is everywhere. Not surprisingly, the previous rector, when upon asked the question in the Goan, said that he was against the plastering, and I think this is also the case with a lot of people in the church or other people. They said plastering would hurt, to quote, hurt the sentiments of people in Goa. This is despite the fact that for the greatest part of its architectural history, that is for 4 centuries, the monument was plastered and whitewashed. In Goa, as discussed earlier, it was the Portuguese restorer Baltazar da Silva Castro, commissioned by Salazar, who ordered removal of the plaster to expose the brown laterite stone surface of the church in 1950s. It is to retain the image of the brown church that even the contemporary period, in this period, that there are appeals for more modern ways to preserving and improving the deteriorating structure. Such nostalgic sentiments to holding on to the particular look of the basilica shows how powerful representations can hold sway over the public, which threatens the survival of the monument, the very building they all adore so much. Therefore, one kind of wonders, if different outcome would have occurred had other images of the church been widely circulated. Images from the pre-1950s period, such as Sousa and Paul's photograph of the church with its plastered and whitewashed wall. See these images, for instance. These are all plastered. On the top is the Archdiocese bulletin. Again, on the masthead was a whitewashed image of the church itself. The contemporary debate on how the basilica is to be conserved shows the importance of seeing the monument through the critical lens of visual history. We need to look at this monument because we are sitting in the comfort of our homes, looking at the monuments through the way in which the monuments, whether it is if today, for example, on Facebook or Instagram or other ways of framing the monuments. And this is an interesting monument because already the brown basilica, what is shown previously, is already making it powerful. So even otherwise, the image would have been powerful, but this is what is seen. And therefore, I argue that we require to have a critical lens of visual history to think about what happens when you wear the lens of history and see that for most part, it was plastered and only for a short while of its history, it has not been. To conclude, the basilica has been part of the living heritage of Goans for more than 400 years. In fact, the next exposition of St. Francis Xavier, to be held in 2024, will mark 400 years since the transfer of Saint's body to Bom Jesus. Not just Bom Jesus, the transfer of Saint body to Bom Jesus. It is a historic moment which is going to be celebrated in 2024. The afterlife of Saint is inextricably linked to the church erected to cradle his remains, and Goans hope that Bom Jesus will continue to stand as a monument to their saint. What is special about Bom Jesus is that the community associated with it continues to use the church on day-to-day basis as a place of worship, even as it is a repository of remains of the saint. The church is part of the living and lived heritage of local community and the region. It is not a relic of the past alone. Thank you for your attention. I would just want to acknowledge, this again, those people who contributed to this lecture. I'm just going to change the slide. Various people, including I've used images by Lester and also acknowledge Fernando, Xavier Vegas, Joki Santos. I don't know whether he's present in this talk, but his research as well has been very useful. Xavier's Center of Historical Research, where some of these images of the old past are there, and so also Central Library. It has been great pleasure to have all these resources for understanding the history of the church. So again, thank you for your attention, and I would be happy to take a few questions. Over to you, Ben.
Thanks, Dr. Kandolkar. Very interesting talk. We do have a few questions before we get into them. I wanted to lead by just sort of reflecting back one of the main issues you raise, which is about how visual culture becomes such an important part of history. So with that in mind, why do you think that there's been such a focus on what you refer to as the contemporaneous visuality of the Basilica, right? Where there's more attention paid to the much shorter history in comparison to this much longer history where it wore, if you will, this white skin versus the brownness of it underneath the white appearance. So yeah, if you could reflect on that very briefly before we move into the questions.
Thank you. Thank you for that question. In fact, this question is very relevant because even today in architecture, influences where you want to show Goan architecture, we have seen that brown exposed laterite has come to be seen as quintessentially Goan kind of look. And this has been to some extent fed by kind of popular culture which emerges from how do you say, debates about making it look older. And this is caught on. In fact, even Charles Correa used that kind of a brown look for Kala Academy. So even so-called modern buildings were trying to be postmodern by reflecting it to Bom Jesus. It's the Bom Jesus which started this crave about exposed laterite. But otherwise here, normally you would want to, this is the lime plaster I would like to specify, and also you'd like to whitewash because there's a particular kind of monsoons which really is going to catch on to the whole thing and lead to deterioration. But also I would like to go back to your question. I think so Anne Stoller, which says about this look about ruins and ruinations and about looking at particular kind of history. If we are to reflect upon the architectural history about the long history of Goa under the Portuguese, it is often referred to as one singular moment and parallel that history to kind of British history. But no, it's 451 years of long history. And therefore, the monuments which are built here are also equally long-lasting, right? But it is the modern way optics, the way in which it works, that when you start cultivating it, seeing in the modern period, and there is a kind of amnesia. And this is kind of a colonial amnesia. We don't want to forget the building, but we also want to forget the period under which Goa was becoming it's kind of having its golden moment, etc. So it's that amnesia which is deliberate, sometimes political, and many times you want to see these past as some kind of past which is gone by. It's not a past which you want to reflect and own. It's a past which wants to be sidelined almost. And it becomes then, the local history becomes subsumed to a kind of a nationalist history. And therefore, local histories are often forgotten, and buildings sometimes fall prey to some of these politics of amnesia, politics of forgetting, politics of not remembering, which takes more effort. But thank you for that question.
Thanks very much. Okay, so over to audience questions and comments. The very first one is from Vincent D'Souza, who asks, he's actually asked two questions. The first is, where in India do we have the expertise to restore Bom Jesus? Is there a good example today that holds up a proper restoration of this kind? And his other question is, how would you negotiate the politics of the Catholic Goans when you sell the idea of original restoration? Would the community support it? Does the Goan Church buy into the idea of restoration? So the first question is about expertise, existing expertise, and then the second is one about the community.
Thank you for that question again. I think so. The first question is that there is this willingness. I think so. The expertise. There is examples in Goa itself where the lime plaster has been done many places. Some of these places has been the case of church in Beti, where it has been done quite well. There are many other examples where lime plaster has been experimented. and it has been done. So the expertise is not so much a problem, but that the problem which kind of goes into the second question is that about thinking about history of the church. Oftentimes, we don't even realize that this church history of Brown Basilica is a very late edition. It's 1950s. It's not its entire lifetime. And we have come to like buy into that whole ideology of thinking about this church as a brown church, which is its original state. I think so we have to also appreciate the fact that this church was not brown, it was plastered, lime plastered. So this whole politics of what is originally in heritage is quite difficult to gauge sometimes. But yes, in fact, Father Patricio, whom I have been, who is the rector of the Basilica, is very much keen. He understands this very well. He's been now coming on board and thinking about this. And I think so there's been a lot of acceptance now in the church itself, thinking that this is, if we require to do something for the church, it requires to be restored in a particular way, ask the expert views, etc. And that would be better. But yes, the church is coming along. Patricio and a lot of people who are in this Save Goa committee are very actively thinking about not just this monument, but about Old Goa itself more actively. And they are thinking about getting in the experts. And ASI, we should not forget that ASI has a role to play, because they do have the capacity and they have a way of bringing the experts and putting these experts together to guide the laypersons also to get these things done. But yeah, a lot of the work can be done working with the community itself.
Very much to your point of community, this next question from Angela Farao, no relation, begins with a comment and goes on to a question. She says, history withheld can lead to a false sentiment. And then she asks, why is the ASI in charge of Bom Jesus, since it's a church in use by locals?
Thank you for the question, Angela. It's a good question, but also a technical question. Even before, I think so, the history of this church belonging to a national committee began in 1833, when all the monuments in Old Goa were declared as national monuments. There was this whole process in 1831 and 1832. They were declared as national monuments. So some of these properties were kind of transferred to a kind of a national committee, and they were supposed to pay special attention in taking due care of these monuments which belong to people. In fact, the national level organizations, their job is to pay special attention that it also retains certain kind of architectural history. So in that sense, ASI is an important institution which should be taken care of. But ASI's history itself in British colonial history is also a little bit, they do not, or were not taking monuments which were completely belonging to active practice. So whenever ASI has worked with monuments which are living monuments, there has been this friction. And it requires, I think so, Tahir himself last time, who was archaeologist with ASI, has discussed the need to work together along with the church to now think that these building requires discussions, negotiations, experts from all the things, and requires, in fact, you are absolutely right, it belongs to community, and everybody, including the church and the ASI, are both working for community. And once we start thinking from that point of view, I think so there'll be more to think about than just ASI or the church as the body.
Thanks. In the chat, if you're interested, Antonio Sobrinho has deposited a picture of Baltazar de Castro himself. And we've got a question from Jose Maria Perez, from a professor from Portugal. She says, ironically, the current recovery of colonial heritage for touristic purposes has led to the kind of colonial nostalgia that's been reproduced to such an extent that the colonial celebration of imperial heritage is what takes precedence. And so I guess the question that she's asking is about this contest between the past and the present.
Thank you, Dr.
Sorry, there's a follow-up to the question. Isn't forgetting as selective as remembering, both culturally and politically?
Thank you, Dr. Perez, it's a very good question, because I think so. There are 2-3 important people who are working in kind of imperial histories and thinking about how imperial histories, whether it is colonial histories or otherwise, affect architectural histories. Samia Hani, who talks about Algeria and France and speaks about how architecture itself becomes ideological. Similarly, Anne Stoller in Imperial Debris, she speaks about ruins and ruination. And there's a particular fascination about ruins, because ruins almost seems as if Old Goa is seen as ruins, then it looks like, oh, this is a past which is over. Ruins give the effect that this is already done, dusted, over, and therefore new can grow out of it, or so to say. It's kind of problematic, because when you start thinking about ruins and a process of ruination as not reflecting that of people, but also thinking about that not only monuments and ruins, but the people who belong to this community are kind of ruins of an imperial past, then it becomes problematic. So in that sense, the basilica is symbolic of what is happening to lots of Goans, that it is kind of under the new way of remembering, there's a new way of forgetting. And these are all imperial moves. And in that sense, there is to some extent deliberation of remembering and forgetting, but also the way in which monuments are seen as simply monuments. See, this is also the other problem, that we do see monuments as simply markers of past and not active lived monuments which belong to people. And when we separate these two, there's something which goes missing. And I think so that requires recovery, and which is why authorities and people should sit, I mean, not people, but people who are in charge should start thinking about what is it doing to people? How does it, and we know that every year, in fact, novenas are going on right now, or every year from 1859, 2 lakh people in 1859 recorded, 8 lakh people in 1859. So every 10 years and every year, people have been so-called voting their affiliation to the saint as much as the architecture here as kind of their own memory of their lived heritage, as their own past. And I think that is they don't forget. People are not forgetting. Imperial histories are being forgotten.
I think, to follow up on Dr. Perez's question about, forgetting and remembering, I'm reminded of Anjali Arundika's work on the Gomantak Maratha Samaj, also a Goan organization. And she laments the lack of research on a community whose archives are open to all. So it's not just that, the information is not available, right? That the processes of remembering and forgetting have very much to do with, if you will, the architecture of how we remember and forget. And so by this, I'm implying that it's about how education, libraries, archives, and so on are constructed to allow access or to withhold access.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think so. Anjali's work is very interesting in terms of archives, but also so many others. And I mentioned Dadu Mandrika today because also, I think so that it's like a common history. And sometimes the reason I was bringing also the idea about the French icon is because if we start thinking of Europe as something as a closed circuit and that it is not being influenced by other parts like Asia, then we already start thinking of West as West and East as East. And there's a certain kind of way in which we perceive these monuments as simply reminders of our past, but it is not. These monuments are Goan. The Goan people's labor has gone to constructing them. There are a lot of Goans who have adopted these things, emulated designs, etc. And this is something I think so, which is very important. I think so. A lot of work is being done in terms of protecting monument. Professor Edgar Ribeiro, etc., has been asking and championing the cause of making some of these historical monuments as part of the regional plan, which is being done recently by the town planning. But more needs to be done, and we require to think about its histories as integral part of what we think of ourselves as. It's a lived heritage.
The next two questions are related, so I'll ask them together. The first is from Thomas Stevens Konkani Kendra, who's the Xavier Center neighbor. Do you think we need to cover the external parts of the church with plaster, or do you suggest any other precaution to preserve the basilica? And then Gomantak Mambre asks, Dr. Kandolkar, as everyone is aware, the old monuments in Goa are subjected to harsh monsoon rains which hastens the process of deterioration. Having said that, the basilica without plaster being a symbol of Goa's tourism, because it's a symbol of Goa's tourism, would it be correct to replaster it to lengthen its age, or would it be ideal to involve Goan conservation architects like Kandolkar, who has been working in the restoration of many heritage structures in Goa, and especially old churches? Has any such project already been undertaken, or are they awaiting approval of funds by the state or central government? Being a monument which can get funding from the ASI considering its age, has any approach been made to heritage lovers and so on to avert the natural calamity as well as the sort of thing that's happened to Notre Dame?
Thank you, both of you, for that question. Ketak Nachnolkar, I think so, is a conservation architect who's been working on this again. I think it was his thesis that he had taken making a master plan for old Goa. I remember very clearly. And he's been working on some of the, I think there are lots of experts in Goa who can come and sit together if the decision is made, how to get it done. It's just a question about thinking it is possible. I think the point I've been making is not about how to do technically this plaster. The point I've been making is that the particular way in which the visual history of empire operates, and in that politics, we often start getting too sentimental about what should be and how should it be preserved. I think if we overcome that ways in which we start looking at imperial histories as not belonging to histories of, and because it is oftentimes says this is a Portuguese monument. Every person who are going to be traveling here, they'll be sold, decided this is a Portuguese monument. No. First of all the heritage which is lying here is Goan, very much Goa and Goan monuments. They has to be removed. This kind of separation of it belonging to one particular era separate has to be removed. The moment you start thinking that, you'll be then more actively thinking about what to do and how to do it. And the moment that happens, I think so we will be far more easier to think about what exactly needs to be done. I think that's more important than the technical thing. I think technical thing, whether it's plastered or not, there are lots of examples and we can sit together and do it. That should not be a problem at all.
Thanks. A couple more questions, but first I want to acknowledge that Teresa de Viceroys has deposited an article in the chat by Sudhapa Das regarding it's on the decay diagnosis of laterite monuments in Goa, a study that was done on the Basilica under Tahir's tenure. And then Vincent D'Souza asks if there is local expertise in conservation. He cites the example of Tamil Nadu, where local knowledge has been used to do repair work. So are there traditional artisans in Goa who could take up conservation efforts? Edgar Ribeiro says that the ASI's mandate is protection, for which postponing decay is their major objective. In his opinion, the ASI would favor plastering the structure and organizing finances accordingly. How do you think we can create a public demand towards this end? So we'll start with those two questions. So the first about local expertise and the second about mobilizing support.
Yeah, as mentioned earlier, there are because heritage is something in Goa, for example, has been a big area and a lot of people have been working into this field. Ketak, as mentioned earlier, is one of them. The ASI themselves have very good expertise. Tahir was an expert. He championed what was essentially a mud pack. It doesn't really work for monsoons here. And I think so ASI is in favor of plastering the monument, but there's been, I think so that it requires to be a clear-cut move. And I think so Edgar is right in saying that can there be more ways of thinking about this monument? I think part of the ways is, I think, thinking about how this monument itself can be, how do you say, removed from just physical, like, because it is so close to everybody and we think that, it represents us the way it is right now, it represents us, but that's kind of false. As I was speaking, it's 52 that the plaster has been removed. And even if you start looking at the Basilica, I think so that's the other thing, that we do not appreciate the fantastic front bassin stoned which is brought all the way. There are no monuments in Goa where the entire facade is decorated with Basai stone. No monuments. And if you look at it in black and white photography, as I've showed earlier, it's the beauty of that dark colored stone on the facade. If you see on the left, that what gives it the kind of so even if you go back to its past, it has a kind of a great artistic value. Whether it is historian Paulo Varela Gomes or other people have already spoken about the value that it's a great church, and it doesn't have to be brown. That's the point. It doesn't have to be brown. If it means that it will be better production, definitely. And this is not the other part about expertise. I think this is not the only area, and I think so Father Patricio was very right. There are people who are coming to, there are different parts of the Basilica. Now I've only spoken about one. There are many parts where a lot of local, whether they are doing work, small time work, or other people, the community wants to participate in conserving the thing, either by contributing in small time, but also doing the labor. They're saying, okay, we can do this gold gilding. We can do some of these things. And for that, you require to really build local people who can start taking care of not just this monument, but many other monuments. And if we start having a kind of a network of local people and artisans who are already having this expertise, then we'll also be giving employment to many of these things. This, in fact, with Fernando and other people who are championing the cause about really creating a kind of a heritage networks is something which we require. We should not be thinking about heritage merely as protection and keeping some monuments to experts, but also participating in actively, whether it is through labor of some people or discussing and talking about it. Thank you for the question.
We are about to close, so there's a few last comments that I'd like to share with you. Lush Diaz says, I think the fact that Rector Father Patricio is on board is a very optimistic sign. If the church can spread the message of the advantage of plaster from the pulpit, it will sway the Goan public opinion in what he considers to be the right direction. Angela Ferrer says there was a problem with the plastering of the Tamdi Sulla temple by the ASI, once again pointing to a kind of division in how people are thinking about plastering versus non-plastering. And one last comment from Edgar Ribeiro, who says that in the UNESCO inscription, they discuss the facade and its sculpture, and that's it.
Yeah. No, thank you so much for all the questions. And we can see, like, there is already, we are so passionate about this monument. It's such an important monument. And also the reason which I was trying to bring in the whole idea about thinking about monuments such as Notre Dame, because we're thinking about the Frenchness of the French. If Notre Dame represents, and architecture has the power to represent that, then it will take everything what is possible to safeguard it. Similarly, I think for Goa, it's a regional history. It is just not representation that it is our monument of what is politically Goa today, but that Goa was almost the queen of the entire the India, which spanned the entire nation from Cape of Good Hope to all the way from Macau. So in that sense, this is a representation of our long participation and different history as a center of power in Asia. And I think so it's very important that we champion the cause of thinking about this very, kind of quintessentially Goan monument, and we think about this as the mother church, so to say, and think about with very open mind about its history and why in a particular way of thinking about it would be useful. So in that sense, and like I shown, for most part it was plastered, and it is still very powerful icon. But thank you for all those questions and all those who have attended this talk. It has been really fulfilling to make this talk happen.
Thanks, Dr. Kandolkar. I'm going to turn it back to Father Anderson. Thanks very much to the Xavier Center for hosting this talk. And over to you, Father Anderson. Thanks very much.
Thanks, Dr. Benedito. Before we conclude, let me propose a small vote of thanks. I'm grateful to Dr. Vishvesh Kandolkar for accepting our invitation to deliver this lecture and for enlightening all of us about the architectural history of the Bom Jesus Basilica, and for motivating, I think, all of us to have this concern about preservation, preserving our heritage, and not only having this concern, but tangibly working towards it. A word of gratitude to Dr. Benedito Ferrão, presently in Germany, for excellently moderating our history hour this evening. Thanks, Dr. Benedito. To all the participants from Portugal, Brazil, Sri Lanka, India, Goa, wherever you are attending from, thanks so much for participating in this lecture, come discussion. If any of you have missed it, we'll post it on our YouTube channel. So for any of you who've missed, you'll get an opportunity to revisit this lecture. I think the pandemic has given all of us this opportunity to connect from wherever we are. And it has given us at the Xavier Center an opportunity to bring these talks and discussions to you right in the comfort of your home. So all the best to all of you. Thanks for participating and have a good day to those of you in the West, and have a good evening to all of you in this side of the world. Yeah, God bless all of you. Good night.
Thank you so much.